And sometimes we need a bit of distance before we can see the gift. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? And you look back and you think there was a gift in that. And at the time, it probably didn't feel that way. But I think for me, that recognizing that we all have far more potential than we give ourselves credit for. My job, I think, when I work with people as a coach, as a trainer, as a speaker, I see more in people than often they see in themselves. And I help them recognize their potential and their purpose very often and help them deliver that. And I think that, having somebody believe in you, be your champion and say, you can do it, or actually, that's not your best, that's not good enough, I expect more from you. I think that's one of the biggest gifts that you can give people. And for me, that's my gift to the world, is to help people be better leaders, to be better at engaging with themselves.
Welcome to your new podcast, Optimum Ideation, with the host and Bridges. Idea interviews. The best of human ideation. Everyone has a superpower. But times are hard, many are in the darkness of their own mind, in need of a helping hand. Helping others to become whole.
Our sponsoring brands:
Third-party people, NFT fashion, TGC fashion.
Enjoy the show with today's guest,
Gina Gardiner. Welcome everybody to the Optimum Ideation Podcast. And today's guest is Miss Gina Gardiner. And I had the pleasure of doing some networking with her and found her to be an amazing person and thought she would be a great guest for our show and for you to have a learn and listen. She's a 3-time best-selling author, inspirational speaker. She's got a master's NLP in business and empowerment and transformational leadership coach. Welcome, Gina.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Yeah, I really appreciated our little interview we did the other day and wanted to, present you to our audience as well.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you.
So we usually just kind of get right into the meat of the subject and want to learn a little bit more about you. So what's your story, your resume, and how did you get to here?
I started my professional life as a teacher, and for the first time really in my life, I felt I fitted in. I loved it. I was promoted very quickly, and I was promoted to be the deputy principal or deputy head of a large school very early, and promoted to be the catalyst for change, because whilst the school was popular, it was very much in the dark ages. Yeah. And I worked with the then principal, John Hughes, for 6 months, and we were strategically planning how we were going to move people who didn't like change, move them from a place of where they were comfortable doing what they were doing to do things differently. And in February half term in the UK, we have a week's holiday in February. I was off skiing. I love skiing. And in those days, it was the fashion to have skis as long as possible. I had a new pair of skis for Christmas, went off skiing with friends, and I proceeded to wrap the extra 10 centimeters around my neck several times during the week. And I'd had a bad fall on the Thursday. And so I'd said to my friends, I'm just going to ski on my own and get my confidence back. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I met them for lunch. They'd found a wonderful new run, and I joined them. However, they took the wrong turning. And so instead of it being a 6-kilometer red run, it was the most difficult black diamond run in St. Anton. And there was no way back. Skied the first third, fell, and then eventually joined my friends who were all sitting on huge moguls. It was a big mogul field. For those of you that are not familiar with moguls, it's where the weather has eroded the snow and you get these great big Well, it could be anything from a couple of centimeters, but these were monsters. These were 6 foot high snow lumps, if you like.
Wow.
And everybody was sitting on a mogul, rather like an elf sitting on a mushroom.
Yeah.
And I'd not been there very long, took my skis off, and the mogul gave way. And I fell between 150 and 200 feet down this mountain run. And life was never to be the same again. To cut a very long story short, I got back to school eventually. And then a very short time later, I went skiing with the borough ski party with 150 pupils. And by the end of the week, I wasn't very well. And I went to bed and suddenly found that I was paralyzed down one side.
Oh, my.
Didn't want to frighten the children. And so I had to wait until people came to check on me. And in a way, that time was difficult. I got back to school just before the summer holidays, but I wasn't right. And I thought, I've got the summer holidays to recuperate. 8 days into the summer holidays, I got a phone call from my then head teacher or principal's wife. Sadly, John Hughes had died in his sleep, and she had found him. So far from it being restful, I spent the summer helping her organise the funeral, let everybody know. And I was then acting principal. I was appointed permanently to the post 4 months later. But my health was not great. Yeah. But I made a decision in going for that job that I wanted the children to experience excellence. And I wanted my staff to have the opportunity to grow and learn, and for it to have a culture of development and growth and teamwork. And I was the head or the principal of that school for just over 20 years. And I ran that school for the most part from a wheelchair.
Wow.
And the huge gift in that was that I had to develop a very different way of developing radical responsibility in my staff as individuals and as teams, because I physically couldn't get into most of the classrooms.
Wow.
So I would like to think that I would have developed that style of leadership anyway, but I'm honest enough to recognize that probably I'd have interfered too much.
Wow.
The gift of that approach to leading yourself first, taking radical responsibility for your own performance and a shared responsibility for the team, is the bedrock of the work that I've done in the getting on for 40 years now, that I've worked in terms of developing people, initially children the first 10 years, and for the last 30 years it's been about developing the potential of adults. And so I'm very grateful for what was a very challenging time, but ultimately out of that challenge has come something that's really incredibly successful. And for me, since 2004, I've worked with businesses, any number of businesses across a whole range of industries. The widgets don't matter because we're talking about people. And if you do the deep dive work on yourself first, that you lead yourself, you take radical responsibility for your thoughts, your beliefs, your actions, your words, or lack of them, how you do it, when you do it. When you do that, it's a real game changer, not only in your personal life, because personal life, professional life, it's still you, isn't it? You're the common denominator you take with you every second of your life. That when you take radical responsibility, you then are stepping into your authentic, genuine power, because nobody can make you unhappy or angry unless you give them permission to.
Right.
But you are then the arbiter of the quality of your life. But it requires you to be honest, not judgmental. And there's a huge difference, not beating yourself up. I should have, I must have, I had, why didn't I? But this is my strengths, and these are my areas for development, and I'm owning those, and I'm going to work on those.
Yeah.
And when you do that, then the quality not only of your own life changes, but the quality of your relationships with other people change.
Yes.
And they change significantly for the better.
Very well said. Yes. Yes, that is optimum ideation at its best right there. The accountability factor, holding yourself accountable. Also, there's a little bit of forgiveness in there that you're kind of talking about as well. And
I would say forgiveness of other people,
yeah,
and of yourself is really important. And I think it's very important to make the distinction that forgiving is not about condoning, and it's not about forgetting.
Yeah.
But it is, if you're forgiving other people, if you don't forgive them, it's like giving yourself the poison to yourself and expecting the other person to die. Because ultimately holding on to the bitterness, the hurt, the trauma doesn't do the perpetrator any harm, but it does harm you.
It's very powerful to flip that and just find the gratefulness in the lesson of, why has this person done this to me, or why did this happen in this manner, and being grateful about it rather than being so angry about it and holding on to it and unforgiving.
I think that's something that people find incredibly challenging, particularly if they don't have somebody externally to perhaps hold the mirror up and say, look, you are allowing the perpetrator, whoever that was and whatever that trauma may be. And I've worked with a lot of people who've been abused.
Yeah.
No matter what they have done, you are allowing that trauma to continue. Yeah. Days, weeks, months, years, decades. Yeah. Beyond that time. Recognize you're a survivor. Recognize that out of that awfulness, you have developed strength and tenacity and resilience. Yeah. So there are things to be grateful for. But I also think that many people find it even more difficult to forgive themselves. Yeah. And for me, guilt has one true purpose, and that's, what's the lesson? What is it telling me that I should do differently? Yeah. What's out of whack with my values? And one of the easiest ways, I think, for people to recognize whether they are taking radical responsibility for themselves is to imagine a horizontal line. And above the line, think about your values. Those are those almost, you can't touch them necessarily, but the things that you hold valuable. And it could be family, it could be integrity, trust, respect, those things. And we bandy those words about at a high level. And if you're a leader of a team or of an organization, really consider how you use the values of your organization. Are they just stuck on a wall, or are they stuck in a handbook? Because if you want them to really make a difference, then you have to identify with your staff, what behaviors do we need to see moment by moment that will demonstrate that those values are being honored. And the most important thing, if you're a leader, then you have to authentically model those behaviors that you want from other people. And if you see yourself going close to the line, any behaviors that are below the line are not in line with your values. But you have to have the clarity, the shared language. And I think that's where people, we've done the tick box exercise of identifying our values, but that's all it is. Yeah. And the language around what are the behaviors, what does excellence look like in the context of our team, our organization? What would we expect to see from everybody if that was what's the difference between good and excellent, between okay and good? And really clarifying that and making sure that the language is living, it's part of your day-to-day conversation. then exchange.
Yeah, I love how you tie language into this, because that was such a layer for me to remove, to make the changes that I needed to make, was the language that I was using.
Yeah.
And it hits you like a rock when you find out. You're like, wow, I am literally spelling myself into disaster.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
I think it's very hard sometimes. I'll give you a small example, and it's a very different type of industry. But the reality is that it doesn't matter what the industry is, the principles are the same. So I was working with a hotel. I just started working with them. They were £8 million in debt. The hotel was empty pretty well the whole time. And it had been inherited by 3 siblings who knew nothing about the hotel trade. And I was invited to come in and do a half-day training on communication. And I hadn't been with them long before I stopped the training and said, look, I can carry on if you want to, but actually this is a sticking plaster on a huge wound, and there is some real fundamental stuff that needs to be dealt with. Otherwise, it's never going to work. And we started to look at, I'm just going to give you one small example. On TripAdvisor, one of the things that they were criticized for constantly was the fact that the hotel wasn't very clean.
Mm.
And so I worked with the housekeeping manager, and we set up a workshop with her staff to say, if you were looking, and we broke it down into a bathroom, bedroom, corridor, wherever. So let's look at the bathroom. What standard is good enough? What would you need to see if you went in there, to experience as a guest when you went into your bathroom? Well, how would you make it from good enough to good? And how would you move it from good to excellent?
Yeah.
And collectively, those staff came up with the criteria that they all agreed that's what excellent looked like, smelt like, felt like. And that became the gold standard. New people coming in would be allotted a mentor who would then teach them the gold standard. And they didn't ever have any more complaints about the cleanliness of the hotel. Because alongside that, the language of the directors started to be, you're a housemaid in the hotel, you're the leading professional for the job that you do. Because it doesn't matter whether you're the CEO or you're the safety manager or the cleaner. If you're the leading professional for your role, then you start to take a pride in that. And they brought it in, obviously things were monitored and checked. But if you had an unsullied track record, then they went into a prize draw and they would get a free weekend, or they would get something. It cost the hotel nothing, but it actually acted as an incentive. Now, if you put this into the context, for example, of safety, where in your industry or many of the people that you work with, I would think that that's paramount, isn't it? That you are dealing with things that can be life-threatening, not just a bit of fluff or a sink that doesn't look particularly good, but something that's really life-threatening. How much more important is it that every member of staff becomes an arbiter of what is great? How should we behave, and what do we do if we see something that isn't great? Do we walk past it and ignore it, or is it our collective responsibility? So the culture of creating that learning and development culture rather than a blame culture is important in every industry, but I would say it's imperative in an industry where safety has to have such a high priority.
Yes. Yeah, that's a big one in energy, in oil and gas. Is some of the best operating companies out there they, from a top-down perspective, they have near miss cards, and if some accident almost happens, they're calling those out in safety meetings, and there's a whole culture around the job site based on the operator. But then your general contractors will have their programs too, and subcontractors will have theirs.
Yes.
So yeah, it's definitely a quality control aspect to what you're talking about.
But so I'd be interested in your opinion that in many organizations, quality control is something that is done to you, that somebody comes in and they'll be the arbiter. Is this good enough or not? For example, I worked in a dental lab where when I first started working with them, the boss, the owner, who also was a senior technician, everything had to be run past him for him to say good enough or not.
Yeah.
But when we started working together, there was a sea change that was people became the arbiter of their own standards because they were trained to have that eye, and there was a collective responsibility rather than people just working in their silos. And it just seems to me that, if you're in an industry where you've got so many moving parts and so many people coming in at different levels, that creating a culture where people take responsibility for their performance and for everybody's safety and the safety of the environment, then you start to have an organization where it becomes a collective responsibility and not somebody wagging the finger and saying that's not good enough. In my short, compared to others, career, let's say 16 years or so, when I started in the field, the safety culture from then until now is way different, at least in the pipeline industry where I was kind of focused midstream. And you have safety videos, and everybody's got stop work authority, and everybody's got buy-in, and if you see something wrong, you stop work and hey, let's address this, and then that winds up in your tailgate safety meeting the next morning, and it's really advanced a lot in this short decade or two. That's a great thing, isn't it? Because if something goes wrong in that context, the possibility for disaster is significant, isn't it?
Yes.
But I mean, anybody listening to this, whether your organization, whether you're talking about, being in the field, for example, or being in the office, and, we could be talking about reputational damage in terms of the quality of the letters that go out, and are they grammatical? Are they spelled correctly? I think this is something that it doesn't matter what you're talking about, whether you're talking about parenting or within a relationship, a personal relationship. These principles are principles for life. They just become it's almost the principles with knobs on when you're talking about an industry where safety is so important.
I love it. I love this conversation, and there's so much to it. I like to think about it as we're peeling these layers away to show our best self, to become our best selves.
Definitely.
And with that kind of topic in mind, we did discuss several layers, and I loved your discussion earlier. But so let's talk briefly about, what layers that you haven't mentioned already that you had to reveal to become who you are now. And then what is your next layer that you need to remove?
I think for me, the area that I didn't realize was so important was seeing myself as a spiritual being.
Yeah.
And I think so many people have this view that it's wiki woo or wacky woo.
Sure.
But I'm reminded that Warren Buffett speaks quite openly about the fact that he did not listen to his intuition as a young businessman and lost $1 billion because of that.
Yeah.
And Richard Branson, again, very successful businessman, Virgin, he talks about the fact that he uses his inner wisdom, his intuition, to identify, have I got enough of the right sort of data? Do I need to hold fire? Is it time to act on that data? And I recognize that a lot of the things that I did unconsciously, as I've become more conscious of myself, as when you think about yourself as a whole being, there's your physical body, your mental and emotional body, but there is also that spiritual side of you, where your inner wisdom, your intuition, is something that as a leader I think is incredibly important to nurture and to develop. And like anything, the more you work with it, the more facility you have to use it. And I would say that that we live in a world which is being profit driven. I think I'd like to think we're moving into a situation where businesses are much more purpose driven. And ultimately, it'll be the businesses that nurture and grow and develop the potential of their staff. And those organizations that want to make a positive contribution to the community, to the world, in a much more holistic way, that will succeed moving forward. We've seen what the profit-driven, numerical, target-driven companies have done to their people. Over half the prescriptions in the UK, and I'm told it's the same in the US, are for antidepressants. We have people who've got burnout. There are people who, during the pandemic, had a taste of life without so much stress. And I think it behoves leaders to recognize that people want to feel they're making a valuable contribution. And being part of something that you believe in is a very spiritual aspect of who we are. Money is important, but it's not, for many people, it's not the most important motivating factor once they've got enough to live on. Of course it is, if you haven't got enough food, even got a roof over your head. And I think more and more when I work with leaders, it is to help them recognize as a whole being that there is this dimension. And again, this is about doing the deep dive work on oneself and looking at how you operate. And when you become an enlightened leader, and I'm all about enlightened leadership, it is about leading authentically with integrity, compassion, courage. It seems to me that your industry has the capacity to be at the leading edge of being purpose-driven to make this world a better place. But it requires leaders who are brave, and who are prepared to do that inner work.
With the proper management, you can get so much done, and it's just it's such a difficult industry to crack that old layer off of them, where they just want to everything's capital, everything is money, and I don't know that it'll ever really change. We can aspire to change, but
well, it's interesting, and I'm going to challenge you, because if you believe that things won't change, they won't. And I'm reminded of a story, it's a true story, of a young man in America who was doing a maths degree. And for some reason, he couldn't make a lecture. But his lecturer said to him, whatever you do, come in, the homework will be on the board, and it counts towards your degree. So make sure that you come in late, but you get down that equation and you work on it, and I'll expect it on my desk by whatever time. Anyway, he went and he got this equation, and he really struggled with it, and struggled. But he thought, well, it's got to be doable. It's part of my course. and eventually he cracked it. His tutor was gobsmacked because it was an equation that the best mathematical brains in the land had failed to solve. Why did he solve it? Because he believed it was possible. In the same way that Roger Bannister, who ran the first sub-4-minute mile, was told, if you run that fast, you'll die. You won't get enough oxygen. But he believed in himself and the capacity to run a sub-4-minute mile. And if you look at the footage, you'll see medics with oxygen bottles waiting to resuscitate him. Now, that he ran it at all, I find amazing. But what I find even more amazing is within 1 month, 30 other people had run a sub-4-minute mile. Why? Because they believed it was possible.
Right.
And so I would say to anybody listening to this, you have to believe that something is possible if you want it to happen. Does that mean that it's going to be easy to crack? Probably not. But if you start off with the premise it's never going to work, that will be a foregone conclusion. If you start on the premise, well, let's be open to the possibility, then it's the difference between banging on a bolted door and an open door.
Yeah. Well, I'm all on board. Getting the rest of these guys in oil and gas, we'll have to work on them.
Well, just step by step. And as you said, if we'd had this conversation 15 years ago,
yeah,
and looked at the safety culture, you would probably have laughed if somebody had said to you, yeah, but it's going to be different.
Yeah.
And yet, because people have seen it's important, they have done things to make a change. And all I'm saying is that this is about the next sea change. And more than anything, if we are going to have a world where we haven't polluted it and we haven't used up all of the resources, the energy industry needs the creativity and the open-mindedness and the capacity to think outside the box of its engineers and its designers and whatever the titles are, to find new ways of doing things. And I have every confidence that if they have the motivation, then they can do it.
So we're coming close to the end here. When you first started in your profession, what was something that was more challenging than you had expected?
I think my first school was in a very nice area, and the children were polite and the parents were pushy, but they were nice. And then I got promotion after 3 years and I moved to a downtown area, and I thought I'd changed planets because the children were very, very different. And to start with, I tried to use the same approach and it didn't work. And what I realized is that if you have to be flexible, that keeping standards, recognizing, again, back to your values, what's important. So for me, discipline is important. Children being polite, being kind to one another, working hard, always very important. But how you approach those children, and grown-ups are just big children. In many ways, grown-ups are far more childish than children are. You can appeal to children's better nature very much more easily often. And so recognizing that, Einstein's definition of madness is to keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result, that if things don't work, then being open-minded and giving things, coming at things from a different angle. And I ran my school for the most part from a wheelchair. I had 2 failed back surgeries. And one of the things that taught, that was hard. But as I said right at the beginning of this, out of every challenge, if we look for it, there is a gift. And sometimes we need a bit of distance before we can see the gift. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? And you look back and think there was a gift in that. And at the time, it probably didn't feel that way. But I think for me that recognizing that we all have far more potential than we give ourselves credit for. My job, I think, when I work with people as a coach, as a trainer, as a speaker, I see more in people than often they see in themselves. And I help them recognize their potential and their purpose very often and help them deliver that. And I think that, having somebody believe in you, be your champion and say, you can do it, or actually, that's not your best, that's not good enough, I expect more from you. I think that's one of the biggest gifts that you can give people. And for me, that's my gift to the world, is to help people be better leaders, to be better at engaging with themselves and with others. And I think we need more people to become the leaders of leaders who will stand and say, actually, we are going to take things further than anybody thought possible. We're going to make a difference, a positive difference. And so I think as life has gone on, I become more and more aware that that's my purpose in life. And if I go right back to when I first started teaching and recognizing that shift from teaching children in an easy area into something that was really very challenging, was great preparation for that.
Wow. I love this little visit we had here, and maybe we can do it again sometime soon. But as we wrap up, do you have a networking event, book, product, invention, or service that we can help promote to the audience? The best
if
way
you go
to
to
get in contact?
That would be wonderful. If you go to my author page, I've got 35 books that people can look at and buy.
Wow.
A lot of those are intentional journals, a lot around leadership. But also I have a syndicated radio show on AM, FM 24/7, which goes live at 4 a.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern on a Tuesday. It's called Gina Gardiner and Friends. And I just love it if people would go and subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is Genuinely You with Gina Gardiner, and Gardiner has an I.
Perfect. And also your main website is ginagardiner.com, right?
It's if they go to genuinely-you.com,
Okay.
that's the main website. But if you look at me on social media, I'm all over the place. You'll be able to find me very easily.
Perfect. Miss Gardiner, I appreciated this time that we had together, and I look forward to networking with you in the future.
I'll look forward to it too. Thank you very much for having me.
Have a great end of the day.
Thank you.
After Party People Production.